Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. Hope you are enjoying. Are all of you having a good night? Nice. Music's good still? Nice. That is wonderful. Alright, how many people do we have in the chat? That is the question we have. I only see one so far. It's really hard to tell who's watching and who isn't. We'll wait again until the 5-minute mark before beginning once more. So lay back, enjoy the music, and we'll begin in 1 minute. Oh. Weird thing, this chapter is not even 3 pages long. It's kind of a problem when a chapter is that short, isn't it? I might combine it with chapter 6, since this chapter is so short. Because it wouldn't be fair to you guys to only have a short stream when it's literally been 2 days, basically. Let's see here. How long is chapter 6? Oh. So I've decided that I'll read chapter 5. I won't close the stream, but I'll take a short break, talk to people, and update the thumbnail and title. Because chapter 6 starts getting pretty freaky. Yeah, chapter 6 is a long one. So, chapter 5, take a short break and update the thumbnail. In fact, let's update the title now. 5 and 6. Save. I don't know how to change the title from here. How unfortunate. Anyway, The Stone Child by Dan Pawlowski. Chapter 5. The first day of school, Eddie kept embarrassing himself. During homeroom, Miss Phelps made him introduce himself. As he'd already learned, new kids were rare in Gates Weed. Everyone already seemed to know each other. Eddie was so nervous and spoke so quietly, Miss Phelps forced him to repeat everything he said, twice. His face burned when his new classmates rolled their eyes at him. In the cafeteria line, Eddie meant to ask the lunch lady for a tuna melt, but he stammered when he ordered and accidentally called it a tuba melt. Everyone behind him started laughing. One boy made farting noises. Finally, after lunch, he bumped into a girl, knocking her book bag off her shoulder. He'd been thinking about the code and didn't see her coming around the corner. "I'm so sorry," said Eddie, helping pick up the bag. He half expected her to start complaining, but instead, she barely looked at him. "It's fine, I can get it," said the girl. She wore a faded black t-shirt, worn-out black jeans, and boots that looked as if they'd been boiled. Her stringy hair hung down either side of her face, tucked behind her large ears. Her skin was pale, but her eyes were dark circles. She looked like a character he imagined would live in a Nathaniel Olmsted book. He realized he was staring, and he felt his face turning red. But before he could introduce himself, the girl blinked at him, fixing her bag, and walked briskly away. "Nice one," said someone from across the hallway. When Eddie turned, he saw the blond boy from the bookstore standing near Eddie's locker with his arms folded across his chest. He wore a navy blue polo shirt and dark jeans. He no longer smelled like bug spray. Eddie felt his stomach clench. Last night he imagined that the boy would be here at school. But after yesterday, Eddie thought he would have to track him down to ask for his help. Now he felt unprepared. "You might want to stay away from her," said the boy. Who is she?" said Eddie as he put away the textbooks he had been given that morning. "Freaky Maggie Ringer. She lives up near the Olmsted estate." Eddie blushed. "Why do you think she's a freak?" "Look at her." "Because she dresses in black?" "Well, yeah, and she doesn't have any friends." Eddie knew what that felt like. "That doesn't mean she's a freak." "If you say so," said the boy. He tugged at his belt loop anxiously. After a moment he said, "I'm Harris May, from the bookstore yesterday." Yeah, I remember you," said Eddie. "I'm Eddie." Why didn't you tell me you lived here? Said Harris. In Gatesweed, he added. I didn't really have time, said Eddie. You sorta took off. Harris blushed. Yeah, sorry about that. I never saw you before. Everyone knows everyone else in this town. But sometimes weird people pass through. I thought you were one of them, said Eddie. Gee, thanks. Harris laughed. I didn't mean it like that. It's just Wally was watching you. Wally? Said Eddie. The one cop this town can afford to keep on its force, said Harris. He doesn't like Olmsted hunters. Olmsted hunters? Fans. They're my mom's biggest customers. Nobody else ever really comes to Gatesweed. When you mentioned the Olmsted curse stuff, he sighed. Ollie had stopped by in the morning before you showed up. He spent like an hour interrogating me about the new graffiti in the park. He thinks I had something to do with it. Did you? Harris smirked. No, he said simply. It's actually really annoying. Every few months, something else appears. Wally usually blames me. The woman is watching. Does the graffiti have something to do with the Olmsted curse? Since Harris just mentioned the word, Eddie figured it was okay to say it now, too. It's sort of hard to explain, and the bell's about to ring, Harris said, glancing down the hallway. Which way are you walking? Eddie shrugged. Not sure. Mr. Ware's English class? Harris nodded. This way. Come on. Eddie closed his locker and spun the combination. His heart raced, partly because he thought he might start finding answers to his Olmsted questions, but also because Harris actually seemed pretty nice. He didn't want to screw things up by saying something stupid like tuba melt again. Leading them down the hallway, Harris continued. So you really don't know anything about the stuff written in that book you showed me? No, said Eddie. Other than the fact that it's some sort of code I can't figure out by myself. I showed it to the librarian in town yesterday. She started acting really weird. What did she do? Said Harris, surprised. She said she couldn't help me, said Eddie. Did you show it to anybody else? Only my parents. They're the ones who gave it to me, said Eddie. Do you know anything about the code? Harris shook his head. Not the code. He paused for a few seconds, then quickly and quietly said, You have to promise not to tell anyone I said anything. It's really important because I could get in a lot of trouble. Some people in town don't like that my mom still sells Olmsted books. They'd rather just forget Nathaniel Olmsted ever existed. Stupid. Sort of hard when his books are, like, everywhere. There's been talk about shutting down the bookstore. Wally's looking for any excuse. Eddie didn't hesitate before answering. I won't say anything to anyone about anything. The hallways were starting to empty. He noticed the room number he was looking for on the door to his right. You don't have anything to do after school today, do you? Said Harris. Not yet. Good, Harris smiled. I hope you rode here on that bike I saw you riding yesterday. You're gonna need it. And that is the end of Chapter 5. Remember, we're only taking a short break. That way I can update the thumbnail a bit. Let me just... there it is. Several more pages. Set that down. How's everyone enjoying it so far? Don't worry, I just might make a new thumbnail. Is everyone night's going well so far? You enjoying the story? And how are you feeling? Nice. That's good. Glad your days are going well. Mm. Oh, fair enough. Dang it. Oh my gosh. Why is it so hard to put one dot? There we go. Well, I hope the drive home is good. Sorry, I'm focusing on the art. This one shouldn't be too hard, to be honest. You're just in time for chapter 6. Sorry. And I'm just about done with E. Just about done with the next piece of art. My gosh. Well, the next chapter is actually pretty long. It's just that the other one was like less than 3 pages, so it seemed kind of silly to stop at like 16 minutes. Alright. Next, I have to... Oh, cool. You put it in. Grab the picture. Remember, guys, it's always best when you make art, you gotta have a server or personal group chat that you can send your art to. So if anybody accuses you of stealing their art when you've made it, you got proof of time and date. Save. Delete. Go back. And now it's time to change the picture. This one's a little different for reasons. I promise it'll make sense later. Okay? It's going to get wild. And we are back to The Stone Child. And once again, by Dan Pawlowski. Is everyone ready? It's time to get spooky. Chapter 6. After the last bell, Eddie called his mother and told her he was hanging out with a friend. Then the two boys rode their bikes up into Gatesweed Hills. Black Ribbon Road carved a twisted path through their dark valleys. They headed in the direction from which his family had come on moving day. Eddie wasn't sure where Harris was taking him, but at this point it almost didn't matter. He was having fun. In Heaverhill, the roads had never zigzagged like this, and the kids had never asked him to come along. While they rode, Harris told Eddie about growing up in Gatesweed. He explained that most of their classmates lived on the outskirts of town, out in the farm country. He and his mother had never lived anywhere other than here, and he couldn't really imagine what it would be like to leave. Eddie told Harris about the car accident, leaving out the part when he thought the animal was a monster. He didn't want to sound like a freak. He mentioned the weird people he'd seen in Gatesweed so far. The policeman, the tow truck guy, the librarian. Harris nodded, as if he knew exactly what Eddie was talking about. He agreed that some people in the town could be a little paranoid and protective of each other in a way. They rode in silence for a while before Harris brought up Nathaniel Olmsted's books. They both read all of them at least twice. Harris told him that his favorite one was The Ghost in the Poet's Mansion. He really loved the part about the secret passage behind the kitchen cabinet that led to the magical library. Eddie told him that his favorite book was The Rumor of the Haunted Nunnery. The way Ronald Plimpton solved all the riddles was so exciting. Harris disagreed that Ronald was an expert. He insisted that Ronald had gotten all of the most helpful information from his grandfather. Eddie noticed that Harris was a little sensitive about who liked the books better, so he made sure not to argue about it. Eddie didn't want to blow a potential friendship, so he changed the topic to Nathaniel Olmsted himself. He asked Harris what he thought might really have happened to him. "I'm not sure. Some people say he got in some sort of trouble and decided to hide for a while." "From who? The librarian?" "Yeah, right." Harris stopped. "Right." Harris stopped and stood on his bike in the road. On the right was the tall, rusty iron fence the tow truck had driven by on Saturday. It was set back in the woods about 30 yards from the road, stretching about 100 feet in both directions. Farther ahead was a small gate. Someone had chained it shut. Nathaniel Olmsted's house sat on the grassy clearing at the top of the hill. The boys stood at the base of the overgrown driveway. Beyond the gate, the road curved around the steep slope and disappeared into the trees. Gnarled vines hung from the branches, and brown grass grew in patches out of the pebbly dirt. At the gate, Eddie was certain they would not be able to go any further, but Harris got off his bike and hiked into the brush, pushed aside some of the thick vines, and revealed a gap wide enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. "We're going in?" asked Eddie, suddenly remembering the animal his father had hit only 2 days earlier. "Is it safe?" Said Harris. "Probably not, but I can't show you what you need to see if we don't. Come on, we'll leave our bikes here." "Won't someone see them?" All of a sudden, Eddie felt nervous. The faces of the people he'd met in Gatesweed scowled at him when he closed his eyes. "We'll get in trouble." "Lay down flat. You can't see them from the road. Believe me, I've checked." "Then you've been here before?" Eddie asked. Harris rested his bike behind a small evergreen bush. "What do you think?" he said. Eddie shrugged, laid his bike next to Harris's, then followed him through the broken gate. Together they hiked the rest of the way up the long driveway. At the top of the hill, the house sat in silence. Eddie couldn't believe he was actually here, seeing the view Nathaniel Olmsted had seen every day. He turned around to take in the countryside. He wanted to see where the house stood. Farther up Black Ribbon Road was the spot where they'd stopped on Saturday. In the opposite direction were the hills through which the road dipped and curved. The town of Gatesweed lay beyond the small, smooth peaks. The blue sky made the house even creepier, as if on a day such as this, the house should have been alive and lived in. But covered in vines and falling apart, the house almost seemed to whisper, "Welcome." "What's the matter?" Harris said. "Nothing. Why?" "You look, I don't know, weird or something." Sorry, said Eddie, stepping toward the house. Eddie pulled a clingy nettle off his sleeve. Goosebumps raced across his skin. He crossed his arms and shuddered. Those dark upstairs windows were dead eyes, but they watched nonetheless. "I don't know. It's creepier up here than I thought it would be." "This is nothing," said Harris, raising an eyebrow. The sound of crickets and chirping birds was interrupted only by the wind and Eddie's imagination. Harris led them to the back of the house, where a small pasture stretched down the other side of the hill. About 300 feet away, 5 rows of small trees dared the boys to come closer. "An orchard," said Harris. "I don't think the fruit grows here anymore." Beyond the orchard, another hill arched up. A thick blanket of trees covered a small ridge. "There," Harris pointed, "is the Nameless Woods." "Why doesn't it have a name?" asked Eddie. "That is its name." Harris trotted off down the hill and across the pasture. He called over his shoulder to Eddie, who stood frozen like a statue. "And that's where we're going." Once over the small ridge, they came to a green carpet of plants stretched under a flat expanse of trees. They continued their hike in silence. Under the dense canopy of leaves, the light filtered dimly, almost green. The forest was surprisingly dark. The smaller trees twisted toward the rare rays of sunlight, fighting for space in the rocky soil. Some of the bigger trees' roots bulged like swollen tentacles of deep ocean creatures. As Harris led Eddie into the woods, they waded through a shallow sea of ankle-high plants. There was no path, only dead leaves and prickly brush. Eddie hoped he didn't end up with poison ivy. Finally, they reached a place where the trees did not obscure the sky. A circular clearing stretched out in front of them. It was approximately 20 feet in diameter. No greenery grew here. The ground was covered with small rocks, dust hung in the air. From the edge of the clearing, Eddie could see a white figure standing just off the center of the circle, closer to the other side. It looked almost like a ghost. "What is that?" Eddie whispered. "A statue," Harris whispered back. "Come on." They slowly made their way across the clearing. A raven heckled them from a nearby tree, but Eddie couldn't take his eyes off the figure. Standing in front of her, he could make out more details. The statue was gleaming white, a girl about his own height. She wore a simple robe that bunched at her shoulders, draped at the waist, and fell pleated all the way to her feet, like something out of a painting he'd seen in an art history book. Her hair was draped in simple wavy ringlets past her shoulders. Her arms were bare, and her toes peeked out from the bottom of the robe. The small domed base on which she stood was carved with all sorts of beasts, dragons, sphinxes, and other strange creatures Eddie did not recognize. Her smile was almost undetectable as her milky eyes stared at Eddie and sent chills up his spine. Her arms were extended, and in her hands she held an open book tilted toward herself. "What does the book say?" said Eddie. "See for yourself," said Harris, staying back. Feeling almost nauseated, Eddie stepped forward, stood on his toes, and peered over the edge of the stone pages. It's blank." Feeling a little too close to her gaze, Eddie stepped away from the statue. "She looks sort of familiar." Harris smiled, raising an eyebrow. Eddie felt like he was missing something. Then it hit him. Isn't she from the haunted nunnery?" said Harris. "Yep." "Whoa," Eddie whispered. He found another of Nathaniel's inspirations. Up close, it looked exactly as he'd imagined it. Something small crunched through the brush outside the clearing, and the raven cawed again. The noises made Eddie's skin prickle, but he told himself that these woods were filled with squirrels, chipmunks, and mice, all harmless creatures that were very good at making crunching sounds. Trying not to sound as freaked out as he felt, he nonchalantly asked, "This is cool and everything, but what does a statue have anything to do with my book?" "I didn't bring you here to look at a statue. I brought you here to look at this statue, and I don't think you've looked close enough." "What do you mean?" Harris crept close to the statue and leaned underneath her book. "Here." Eddie ducked under the book, too. There was something carved there. Eddie leaned closer to see what it was. The symbol from the first page of this word again. The title of the enigmatic manuscript was engraved clearly into the book's stone cover. The pie symbol. A cool rush crept underneath Eddie's clothes, tickling his skin. "What the heck is going on here?" he said. Harris didn't say anything for a moment. He stood next to Eddie and stared at him. Finally, he said, "Creepy, huh? I know the feeling." Eddie reached out and ran his finger along the cold stone spine of the book. How did you hear about this place?" "After Nathaniel Olmsted disappeared," said Harris, "the town sent out a search party. They came across this clearing. It sort of became a local legend in Gatesweed. Nobody knows for sure who this statue is supposed to be, who carved it, or why it's here." "Really?" said Eddie. "Hasn't anyone ever tried to guess?" "I've heard some of the high school students say it's a gravestone," Harris said, shoving his hands into his pants pockets. "A gravestone out here in the middle of the woods?" The thought gave Eddie goosebumps again. "Who does it belong to?" Harris shook his head. "No one knows. There's no name on the stone," he whispered. "But they also say its ghost haunts these woods." "A ghost?" said Eddie, glancing over his shoulder. "What kind of ghost?" "Some people say they've seen the ghost of an old woman wandering around Nathaniel Olmsted's estate." "Really? Really?" said Eddie. He looked up at the statue. She stared at him blankly. "That's not the only thing people have seen up here," said Harris. "People tell stories of strange animals, weird noises, stuff like that." "Strange animals?" Eddie's stomach squelched. The thing that totaled my dad's car on Black Ribbon Road was pretty weird looking," he said. He still didn't mention that he'd thought it was a monster. The accident had happened so fast he wasn't sure what he'd seen anymore. Did you see anything strange the last time you came up here?" Harris laughed. "If I had, do you think I'd be wandering around these woods with you?" Eddie chuckled too. "I guess not." "I mean, yeah, I heard some noises I couldn't explain," said Harris. "And once or twice I thought I saw a shadow move, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. Then again, I'm pretty skeptical when it comes to stuff like this. Sure, I like Olmsted's books, but I know the difference between what's real and what's made up." Eddie didn't quite believe him. Harris continued. "People in town are pretty serious about the legend of the statue, though. They talk. Some people think that if you stay up here too long, the ghost of the woman will follow you home. She'll haunt you until you go crazy. That's probably why the librarian freaked out when you showed her your book. Mrs. Singh's definitely heard about the statue's symbol. When she saw it on the first page of your book, she must have thought you'd already been up here. She didn't want the ghost to follow her, too." "That's dumb," said Eddie, forcing a laugh. "People in Gatesweed really believe that?" Harris scoffed. "Yeah, actually. Some of them really do. But then again, a few of them are crazy, if you ask me." "Seems like someone's crazy enough to graffiti that statue in town." When Harris gave him a knowing look, Eddie continued. "So weird. Someone had painted this awful face onto the pedestal with swirling black squiggles for eyes." Harris smiled reluctantly and crossed his arms. "Once someone spray-painted it on the side of my mother's store," he said. "The woman is watching," in big black letters. It took forever to clean it off." "Someone graffitied your store because of the Olmsted curse?" Eddie asked. "They didn't want her selling his books?" "Exactly," Harris nodded. "They think the less people who come through town, the less trouble there will be here. To them, Gatesweed is filled with dirty little secrets. Nathaniel Olmsted's disappearance being number one, but my mother was friends with him, and she'll never stop selling his books in her store, no matter how many times people paint nasty things on her front porch, or how many people believe his monsters are real." A pair of red-rimmed yellow eyes blinked in Eddie's memory. He remembered the articles he read on the internet about the curse. People really think his monsters are real? He said, clutching his book bag even tighter. Yeah, said Harris. Some people do. Like the animals people say they've seen in these woods. I've never seen them, but I've heard people say they look like the ones Nathaniel writes about. Everything that happens in this town gets blamed on him, and he's not even here anymore. People stopped going to the movie theater on Main Street because of the things they said lived behind the screen. And the mills closed down after the owners kept finding huge gouges in their machinery. People said they looked like bite marks. And of course, a small group of people blamed the new mill bridge collapse on Nathaniel's trolls. After everything else, that one was pretty much inevitable. Lots of people left town when the mills closed. That sort of destroyed Gatesweed, so it makes sense that people need someone to blame. But still. What about the symbol on the statue? Said Eddie. Do you know what that means? I read something about the Greek letter pi, which looks almost exactly like the symbol carved here. He pointed at the girl. Right, from math class, said Harris. Maybe. We could look into it. But I'm not very good at that subject, and I don't know a thing about Greek. What I do know is that the book you found is important. I was so happy when I saw you in school today, that you weren't just an Olmsted hunter, chased away by old Wally the Weasel. That's what my mom calls him, said Harris with a smirk. I was thinking about your book all night. The code has to mean something. The symbol on the statue is the connection. I brought you here so that you'd understand. The secret of the book in your bag isn't just about a code. It's about this place, this statue. It might be about Nathaniel Olmsted himself. Who knows? Maybe if we solve it, we'll find out what really happened to him. Maybe we can clear his name. Then people will leave my mom alone. Yeah, totally, said Eddie. Nathaniel Olmsted would also probably give us his autograph or something, if he's, still alive. As he said the words, he felt foolish, disrespectful, especially in this place, so close to where the man had lived. He wandered to the opposite side of the circle. So, do you think the book might have belonged to Nathaniel Olmsted? The land sloped down quickly. At the bottom where it leveled out, the hill was met by a lake, about 30 feet across. The trees on the other shore concealed a steep, rocky hillside that jutted high above the water. Through the thick foliage, the tree roots were visible, clinging, almost clutching, at the cliffside. Near the water's edge, several long, leafy branches hung down from the trees and dangled just above the calm surface, tickling their own reflections with stringy shadows. If not, at least it belonged to someone who knows about the nameless woods, the nameless lake, said Harris, following Eddie across the clearing to the top of the slope, and the symbol on the statue. Which could be anyone in town, said Eddie, right? He picked up a pebble from the edge of the clearing before heading down the hill. Yeah, said Harris. But no matter who it belonged to in the past, now it's up to us to figure it out. Eddie nodded, excited. Was Harris suggesting they work together? That they become friends? Yeah, he said as they neared the edge of the lake. It's up to us. So how should we start? Said Harris. At the shore, Eddie tossed the pebble. It bounced across the sky's reflection, splashing several times before disappearing underneath the surface. I have already taken the one code book out of the library, said Eddie. But it's really confusing and not much help. The raven called to them from the top of the hill near the statue, louder this time. Forget about it then, said Harris. I'm sure we can find some sort of pattern on our own. Eddie was about to take the enigmatic manuscript out of his bag so they could get started, When near the far shore, the calm surface of the water suddenly rippled, as if something large had risen from below. The raven at the top of the hill took off for the sky. Wide-eyed, the boys looked at each other. "I think the sun's starting to go down," said Harris, stepping away from the shore. "Did you see that?" said Eddie. Small waves disturbed the water at the center of the lake. Eddie stepped forward, trying to peer through the blue sky's opaque reflection. He could see a dark shape shifting and squirming in the hazy depths 15 feet from the shore. The shape reminded Eddie of a fast-moving storm cloud, swirling and rolling in upon itself as it grew stronger. The forest behind him was suddenly quiet, as if all its inhabitants did not want to be heard. From where he stood, Eddie could see the dark, cloudy shape rise to the surface of the water from below, creating a dark spot nearly 5 feet in diameter. The edges of the black spot seemed to pulsate and roil, spreading its wide fingers out across the top of the lake, like a fist slowly opening. "Is that an oil slick?" Eddie asked. "I don't know what it is," said Harris, staring at the spot intently as it continued to grow. Now it had doubled in size. It floated in stark contrast to the sky's blue reflection, turning the water black as it spread outward. "It's coming from the bottom of the lake." Eddie leaned forward, like a geyser. He was frightened, yet at the same time he was curious. Or maybe not, I can't really tell. He'd never seen anything like this before. After Harris's spooky stories about the woods and the town, he felt compelled to run away. But he also wanted to stay, to see what would happen as the black shape grew and grew. This almost seemed like something that would happen in a Nathaniel Olmsted book. But of course, Eddie told himself, those stories were not real, in spite of what people believed. Now, the dark shape in the middle of the lake was as large as a small island, taking up almost all of the water's surface. The blue reflection from above had been replaced by darkness from below, as if someone had covered the sky with a blanket. Yet, when Eddie looked up, he could see the sun still shining somewhere beyond the canopy of trees near the horizon. Even so, the afternoon light barely broke through the tree tops. Then Eddie noticed something even weirder. In the water, there began to appear little white specks of light, which wavered as the surface rippled slightly. Eddie was reminded of a book he'd read about phosphorescent algae. He also remembered reading about a type of shrimp capable of producing a small amount of light, like a firefly. But these specks of light didn't look like algae or shrimp or fireflies. They appeared to be something else, something familiar that Eddie couldn't quite name. "Are those stars?" whispered Harris. The darkness reached the shore, so that now, except for the specks of light, the entire lake had turned black. The water did not merely look dirty, but impenetrable and infinite. Eddie cautiously leaned forward even farther. "You're right," he said. It almost looks like a reflection of the night sky." He glanced up at the cirrus clouds wisping in the afternoon light, then shook his head, baffled. He bent down and picked up another pebble from the edge of the water. He was about to toss it in to see what would happen when Harris grabbed his arm. "Don't," said Harris. "Look." The specks of white had turned red, and he realized they no longer looked like the reflection of stars from above. Now the lights were clearly floating just below the water, close enough for Eddie to reach out and touch. The sight was almost hypnotic. Eddie began to feel dizzy. Suddenly he knew what would happen next. He He read about it in one of Nathaniel Olmsted's books on Saturday night.
Eddie, get away.
Harris yanked him backward as something large in the middle of the lake splashed the dark water. Several waves came rolling slowly toward the shore. Unable to look away, Eddie felt his skin go prickly with goosebumps. His mouth felt as if it was filled with dust. His hands were numb. Harris continued to pull on his sleeve. When Eddie glanced at him, he could see fright welling up in Harris's eyes. His mouth had fallen open, and his skin had turned ashen. Seeing Harris afraid made Eddie twice as scared as before. Harris swiftly shot his finger to his lips and nodded toward the hillside. Slowly backing away, the boys made it to the edge of the woods. Several pine branches poked into Eddie's back. He jumped. The splashing in the middle of the lake stopped. Small waves finally rose up and rolled onto the pebbly beach, breaking and washing the shore in a slow, steady rhythm. The soft lapping of the water was the only sound Eddie could hear. Then, several feet from the edge of the lake, a shape churned in the water, something rising from the shallows below the surface. A muffled howl resonated faintly from its direction. Eddie's mouth dropped open in horror as he saw what looked like a long black snout and a flash of several sharp white teeth. The boys turned and ran as fast as they could, slipping and sliding up the slope in the mud and dirt. At the top of the hill, the statue watched silently as the boys ran through the clearing and into the woods. Eddie followed Harris, leaping over large roots and half-buried rocks that jutted out of the ground every few feet. In some places, the trees had grown densely together. Trying not to slip in patches of silt and leaves, the boys weaved back and forth as if through an obstacle course. Even though he was nearly out of breath, Eddie glanced over his shoulder. But there was nothing there. Still, he wanted to get away from the place as quickly as possible. And he sprinted into the woods, clutching the straps of his bag, which bounced against his back. At the edge of the flatland, the boys briefly caught their breath before heading over the ridge. Through the orchard, past Nathaniel Olmsted's house, and all the way down the long driveway. By the time they got to their bikes, Eddie was feeling faint. He dropped to the side of the road and hung his head between his knees. After he caught his breath, he glanced up at Harris, who was leaning against the fence in shock.
"What the heck just happened?" said Eddie. "I thought I saw dogs coming out of the water for us." "I'm not sure what I saw," said Harris, red-faced and wary. "But I have an idea." He pushed himself away from the fence and stumbled toward his bike. "There's something I think you should see." "It's not another statue, is it?" said Eddie. Harris shook his head, lifted the handlebar, and set his bike upright at the edge of the road. After swinging his leg over the seat, he kicked at Eddie's bike, which was still on its side in the brush. "You think you're okay enough to ride this thing back to my place?" Eddie nodded. "Because we should probably get the heck out of here."
And that is the end of chapter 6. I hope you all enjoyed the story, and have a good night.